How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Saturday night. Good Vach, Shavua Tov. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night? Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bella in Florida. Sharon says, Shavua Tov, saw Guns N' Moses tonight again at our local Chabad. That's awesome. Sharon, do me a favor, email me and connect me with your rabbi. I would love to thank him for screening the movie at his Chabad. Also welcoming Lester in Florida, Ella in Southern California, Elise in Virginia. Welcome everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Rabbi Carrie Cosberg in honor of Sal and Nina. That's so sweet of you, Rabbi Cosberg. Thank you so much. And thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world in the merit of that and all the fine work you do for your community. May you be showered, you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and we say Amen. If you would like to sponsor an episode of AT Daily, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. I'm mentioning it at the beginning of every show here in December because it's our annual campaign, fundraising season. We are a nonprofit. It costs money to produce and share and disseminate all this content, and we need your help. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay. Our daf tonight is page 86. We're picking this up near the bottom of 85b with Mishna number 3 here in chapter 9 of tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. Says the Mishnah, and these are the items that if they ascended upon the altar, they descend, right? So we've been talking about items that should not have ascended onto the altar for one reason or another, like a disqualified offering, and therefore the limbs or the carcass of a burnt offering that normally would be burned on the altar pyre should not have gone up because the offering was disqualified. For example, if the person slaughtering it had the wrong kind of offering or the wrong owner in mind at the outset. But if nevertheless, by mistake, they went up the ramp to the altar, then the altar sanctifies those things and they shall not descend because they should have they had a period of fitness and they became disqualified in sanctity, as we have learned. There are other items that even if they go up, the altar does not sanctify them because they never should have gone up in the first place. They never were fit for the altar. So here we're talking about some items that if they ascended, nevertheless, they shall descend. The altar does not sanctify them. They do not remain on the altar. If that mistake was made and then we realize there's a mistake, before they're burning in the altar pyre, we walk them back down the altar. The priest walks it back down the altar. What are these items? The meat of offerings of the most sacred order. Wait, What? Aren't there parts of sin offerings and guilt offerings that do go up on the altar? They're fit for the altar? Why would you say that the meat of sin offerings and guilt offerings is not fit for the altar and so unfit that if they ascended, they shall descend? Because we're talking about the portion of a sin offering or a guilt offering that is eaten by the priests. That never should have gone up. And if it did go up, it comes back down. The meat of offerings of the most sacred order, i.e. guilt offerings and sin offering, the meat of which is eaten by priests, and the meat of offerings of lesser sanctity, which is eaten by the owners, like a peace offering or a thanks offering, and the surplus of the Omer meal offering brought on the second day of Passover after the handful was removed and burned on the altar, and the 2 loaves meal offering brought on the festival of Shavuos, and the showbread, right, which just sits on the table inside the sanctuary from week to week, has no business going up on the altar, and those breads are eaten by the priests after they're taken down 1 week after they go up. They have no business on the altar. If somebody took them on the altar, we take them back down. And the remainder of the meal offerings after the handful was removed, which are all eaten by the priests. And the incense that ascended upon the external altar and not the golden altar where it should be burned, right? The incense that burned every day in the holy temple, very special formula, that is burned on the inner altar, the golden altar inside the sanctuary. If some priest by mistake walked it up the external altar, it shall come back down. With regard to the wool that is on the heads of the sheep that are brought as burnt offerings, and the hair that is on the head of goats that were sacrificed, and the bones, and the tendons, and the horns, and the hooves. So, do they not go up? Evidently not. But if they do go up, let's see. So when they are attached to the flesh of the offering, they shall ascend upon the altar and be sacrificed with the altar, as it is stated, and the priest shall make the whole, W-H-O-L-E. Oh, that's unfortunate. Okay. With regard to the wool that is on the heads of the sheep brought as burnt offerings, and the hair that is on the head of the goats that were sacrificed, and the bones and the tendons and the horns and the hooves, when they are attached to the flesh of the offering, they shall ascend upon the altar, and be sacrificed with the offering, as it is stated, and the priest shall make the whole smoke on the altar. Sorry, I got distracted by my system here is not recording tonight's episode. But what I was saying is the whole, W-H-O-L-E, all of it, right, in that verse. And the priest shall make the whole of it smoke on the altar. Leviticus 1:9. If they separated from the flesh of the offering, they shall not ascend. As it is stated, and you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, and nothing else. Right? So when we're talking about burnt offerings and the portions of sacrificial offerings that are burned on the altar pyre, now we're getting some insight into what is it, right? We've already said they don't put whole animals on the altar pyre, right? It gets flayed, the skin gets removed, it gets butchered, it gets cut up in pieces. And so the hair, right, that goes with the skin, that doesn't go up. Now, when you're butchering, sometimes it happens that the butchering is imperfect and there's some of that hair, some of those tendons, some of those bones bones, especially, if they're attached to the flesh, they go up. But if they get detached from the flesh, then even though it was part of the body, part of the carcass of that offering, if it became detached, it should not ascend. That's the Mishna. Now the Gemara. The sages taught in a baraisa. And the priest shall make the whole smoke on the altar, right? All of it. W-H-O-L-E. Smoke on the altar. And the term, the whole, serves to include the bones and the tendons and the horns and the hooves among those items that are sacrificed on the altar. So it sounds like, why would you think that we don't? It's all of it, right? Well, one might have thought that even if they separated from the flesh of the burnt offerings, they are sacrificed upon the altar. Therefore, the verse states, and you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, indicating that only those items and anything attached to them are sacrificed upon the altar, but not things that have become detached from the flesh. If one derives the law with regard to bones and tendons from the phrase the flesh and the blood, then one might have thought that a priest must first remove the tendons and bones from an offering and then sacrifice the flesh upon the altar. Therefore, the verse states, and the priest shall make the whole smoke on the altar, including the tendons and bones. So how can these texts be reconciled? If they were attached to the flesh, they shall ascend. If they separated from the flesh, then even if they are already at the top of the altar, they shall descend. Now we're on page 86a. The Gemara notes, who is the Tana that you heard that says, if they separated, they shall descend? It is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. As it is taught in a Baraisa, and the priest shall make the whole smoke on the altar. And the term the whole serves to include the bones and the tendons and the horns and the hooves among those items that are offered on the altar, even if they separated from the flesh of the offering. But if so, how do I realize the meaning of the verse, and you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, which indicates that only the flesh and the blood of an offering ascend upon the altar? This verse is necessary to tell you an additional law, that you return the consumed flesh of a burnt offering to the fire if it is dislodged from it, but you do not return the consumed tendons and bones if they are dislodged from the fire. Again, drawing a distinction, right? It's a big bonfire on top of the altar, right? And they put the flesh of these animals on it, and sometimes, coals, wood from the fire, or some of the limbs of these offerings fall off the fire. I mean, if you've ever tended a fire, a bonfire, even a fireplace, things jump around in a fire. And sometimes, on a fireplace, that's why you have a grate, because things could come flying out of the fireplace when logs settle and bounce, etc. A little crackling, they're tiny explosions, right? Well, on a big bonfire that doesn't have a grate around it, stuff could definitely fall off, can become dislodged from the fire. So if it's pieces of the animal flesh, right, those are returned to the fire so that they can complete the process of being burned. But if there are these other pieces that never really were intended to be part of the fire, they only went in because they were attached to the flesh, now they've jumped out, we leave them out. The Baraisa continues that Rebbe says that one verse states, and the priest shall make the whole smoke on the altar, which included tendons and bones. And one verse states, and you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, which excluded any part other than the flesh and the blood. And how can these texts be reconciled? If they were attached to the flesh, they shall ascend. If they separated from the flesh, then even if they are already on top of the altar, they shall descend. New topic. The Mishnah teaches that items that are not meant for consumption on the altar, such as the bones and tendons, are sacrificed along with the flesh if they are attached to it. But if they separated, they shall not ascend. So Rabbi Zera said the sages taught that if they separated from the flesh, they shall not ascend only when they separated from the offering downward, i.e., away from the altar, whereby they became distanced from the altar pyre, the bonfire atop the altar, when they became separated. But if they separated from the offering upward, i.e. they became closer to the pyre, when they separated from the offering, I mean, this is like they're carrying the limbs up on the altar, and some it wasn't butchered quite right, and so these hooves, let's say, that should have been removed weren't removed properly, but as they're carrying it up, it falls off. So if it rolls down the ramp away from the altar pyre, then we leave it off the altar, it descends. But if it kind of bounces forward, or once they're on top of the altar, remember the top of the altar was a large space, 30 to 40 feet square. The altar fire is just in the middle of that, so it could be once you reach the flat part at the top of the altar and then something falls off, but it doesn't get further away from the fire, it even rolls toward the fire. So according to this teaching, it's going to end up going on the fire. We don't separate it. And they shall ascend. And the Gemara asks, and even if they separated, shall they be offered? Doesn't the Mishnah state that they shall ascend only if they are still attached to the flesh? What difference does it make if it fell and rolls toward the fire? It's no longer attached to the flesh. Why does it now descend? So Rabbah said, this is what Rabbi Zera is saying. It was necessary for the sages to teach the law that bones or tendons that separated from the flesh of an offering shall not ascend the altar, only where they separated after the sprinkling of its blood, since at the time that the flesh itself became permitted for the altar through the sprinkling, the bones and tendons were still attached to the flesh, and therefore fit to be offered with it. But if they separated from the offering before the sprinkling of its blood, they shall certainly not ascend, as they were already separated from the flesh when it became permitted for the altar. Instead, the sprinkling comes and permits them for any use, just as the hide of a burnt offering is permitted to the priests upon the sprinkling of its blood. Right? So recall, a burnt offering. The concept of a burnt offering is that it is entirely consumed on the altar, and yet its hide is not consumed on the altar. The hide is separate. That's what we say. We flay the offering after it is slaughtered, and the hide goes to the priests, and the rest of the animal, the butchered part, goes up on the fire. So now they're making a distinction about what was the status of the animal at the time of the sprinkling. Now, I think this is interesting because the way I've been imagining this is that whatever, the animal is slaughtered, its blood is collected in a service vessel, conveyed to the altar, and sprinkled. The animal hasn't been butchered yet. So at the time of the sprinkling, the animal is still complete, right? So its hooves and tendons and bones are attached to its flesh. And so according to what we just read, that would mean that those things do need to go up on the altar. But we're saying they don't go up on the altar. So why would the time of the sprinkling be dispositive? Well, it's dispositive for this other idea, right? That now we're talking about me'ilah, misuse of consecrated property, that the hide goes to the priests, right? That is a gift to the priests, that burnt offerings which are brought in the temple, before they are burned on the altar pyre, they're flayed. And those skins that are removed, that's leather, right? That's valuable leather. And that becomes the property of the priests. But it only becomes the property of the priests, available for them to take it and use it for their own benefit after the sprinkling of the blood. If they were to take it before the sprinkling, that would be me'ilah, misuse of consecrated property. So let's keep reading. I just want to say it again. Rabbah said, this is what Rabbi Zera is saying. It was necessary for the sages to teach this law, that bones or tendons that separate from the flesh of an offering shall not ascend the altar, only where they separated after the sprinkling of its blood. Since at the time that the flesh itself became permitted for the altar through the sprinkling, the bones and tendons were still attached to the flesh, and therefore fit to be offered with it. But if they separated from an offering before the sprinkling of its blood, they shall certainly not ascend. And they were already separated from the flesh when it became permitted for the altar. Instead, the sprinkling comes and permits them for any use, just as the hide of a burnt offering is permitted to the priest upon the sprinkling of its blood. In fact, one may even use such tendons or bones to fashion the handles of knives from them. Whereas if they were still attached to the flesh, they would go up and be burned on the altar pyre. If they separated, then once the blood is sprinkled, right, the priest can, after the blood is sprinkled, if they're now separated from the flesh, they can make personal use of it, right? The hide can become leather jacket, and these bones and tendons can become the handles of knives for personal use. And the Gemara elaborates, Rabbah holds in accordance with that which Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael. It is stated he shall have the hide of the burnt offering that he has offered, Leviticus 7:8. And with regard to a burnt offering, and it is stated the priest that makes atonement, he shall have it, Leviticus 7:7. With regard to a guilt offering, the following verbal analogy is derived from here. Just as the blood of a guilt offering is presented, just as after the blood of a guilt offering is presented, its bones become permitted to the priest for any use, since only the portions intended for consumption on the altar are sacrificed, whereas the rest of the animal is given to the priests. So too, with regard to a burnt offering, bones that are not attached to the flesh and therefore are not intended for the altar are permitted. And the Gemara notes the phrase, he shall have, is free. Free means that it's superfluous language, that we would have understood the law without this word or this phrase. Therefore, it is free for exegesis, right? For hermeneutical interpretation to say, this word was included in this law, not to clarify the meaning of the law. I would have understood it without that word, but rather to link it to another law where that same word occurs, and to teach us that we can learn an element of that law and apply it to this law. That's what it means when a word or phrase is free. So the phrase, he shall have, is free, i.e. superfluous in its context and therefore available for the purpose of establishing a verbal analogy. And there is a principle that such verbal analogies are not refuted, as if these words were not considered free, the verbal analogy could be refuted by saying, what is notable about a guilt offering? It is notable in that its meat is permitted and its bones are therefore permitted as well, while the flesh of a burnt offering ascends upon the altar in its entirety. If so, laws may not be applied to one based on the other. Consequently, the phrase he shall have with regard to a burnt offering is considered as having been written superfluously, as it would have sufficed to state that the hide of the burnt offering that he has offered to the priest. Give it to the priest. We didn't really need he shall have. So Rav Ada bar Ahava raises an objection to the explanation of Rabbah from a Baraisa. With regard to the bones of sacrificial animals, specifically sin offerings or guilt offerings, which are offerings of the most sacred order that are intended for consumption, before the sprinkling of their blood, one who benefits from them is liable for misuse of consecrated property, similar to the law with regard to the flesh of offerings of the most sacred order before their blood is sprinkled. After the sprinkling of their blood, one who benefits from them is not liable for misuse of consecrated property, as they are not intended for sacrificing upon the altar. But concerning the bones of a burnt offering, one who benefits from them is always liable for misuse of consecrated property. This Baraisa contradicts the opinion of Rabbah, who said that if the bones separated from a burnt offering before the sprinkling of its blood, it is permitted to derive benefit from them. And the Gemara answers, say that the Baraisa meant the following. But concerning the bones of a burnt offering, if they separated before the sprinkling of its blood, and its blood was then sprinkled, then one who benefits from them is not liable for misuse of consecrated property. If they separated after the sprinkling of its blood, one who benefits from them is always liable for misuse of consecrated property. Me'ila. And Rabbah disagrees with Rabbi Elazar. As Rabbi Elazar says, if the bones of a burnt offering separated from its flesh before sprinkling, one who benefits from them is liable for misuse of consecrated property. If they separated after sprinkling, the sages decreed that one may not benefit from them ab initio. But if one benefited from them after the fact, he is not liable for misuse, since by Torah law they were permitted through the sprinkling of the offering's blood. Right? So what we see over and over again that the sprinkling of the blood is the dispositive moment in the procedure of bringing an offering. It's when the person who's obligated to bring a sin offering achieves atonement. It's when the person who vows to bring a burnt offering has fulfilled his vow. It's when somebody who vows to bring a peace offering has brought his peace offering. Even though there are many steps after the sprinkling of the blood, that's really the moment that turns things, right? So it's considered when the purpose of the offering has been achieved. After that, it's a kind of falling action. And so what was going to be permitted to a priest becomes permitted at the sprinkling. What is considered attached or detached is measured at the time of the sprinkling. Okay, and that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 9. And we move on to Mishnah number 4. And all of those disqualified offerings with regard to which it was taught on page 84a, that if they ascended, they do not descend. In a case where they were dislodged from upon the altar, the priest does not restore them to the altar. And likewise, with regard to an ember that was dislodged from the altar, the priest does not restore it to the altar. As for limbs of a fit burnt offering that were dislodged from upon the altar, if they were dislodged before midnight, the priest should restore them to the altar, and one is liable for misusing them, right, me'ila, because it's still consecrated property. But if they were dislodged after midnight, the priest does not restore them, and one is not liable for misusing them, as one is not liable for misuse of consecrated property after it has fulfilled the purpose for which it was designated. So interesting here. Now we are measuring beyond the sprinkling of the blood. Rather, since the burnt offering has to be consumed by the altar, then those limbs are going to be burning right during the night. Have you ever burned something in a bonfire? Some things are totally turned to ash and some are not. So until midnight is the cutoff that the sages decreed, things have to keep burning. After midnight, okay, like whatever's left, if it's pure ash or if it's kind of like a blackened, hardened, dried out stump, that's going to be considered like ash. And then if somebody were to take some ash and use it, for fertilizer or something, it's no longer me'ila because whatever the property was consecrated for, it has fulfilled its sacred mission, and now somebody could benefit from it. With regard to unfit items, that if they ascended, they do not descend, just as the altar sanctifies items that are suited to it, so too the ramp sanctifies items that are suited to it. Just as the altar and the ramp sanctify items that are suited to them, so too the service vessels sanctify items that are placed in them. Very interesting ruling. So we're saying that something that shouldn't have gone up on the altar, but it did, then it won't descend. Well, if it just gets onto the ramp, it's going to be the same result because the ramp sanctifies that item in the same way that the top of the altar does. And interesting that service vessels, something that shouldn't have been placed in a service vessel because it was disqualified, but it was fit to be placed in that service vessel at some point, then once it's in the service vessel, it's considered sanctified, and that's going to have implications downstream from that moment in the offering procedure. Okay, that's Mishnah 4. Now we move on to the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that limbs of a fit burnt offering that were dislodged from upon the altar before midnight are returned to the altar. But if they were dislodged after midnight, they are not returned. And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If the limbs have substance, i.e., they were not yet consumed in their entirety by the fire, then even if they were dislodged after midnight, the priest must return them to the fire. If they do not have substance and have been reduced to ash, then even if they were dislodged before midnight, the priest does not return them to the altar. And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary. Now we're on 86b. With regard to hardened limbs that were dried by the fire, but have not yet been reduced to ash. And the Mishnah teaches that before midnight, such limbs should be returned to the altar. And the Gemara asks, well, from where is this matter derived that midnight determines whether or not they shall be returned to the fire on the altar? And Rav says, one verse states all night, and he shall burn the burnt offering, which indicates that there is a mitzvah, a commandment to burn the limbs of a burnt offering all night. As the verse states, it is the burnt offering on the pyre upon the altar all night until the morning. Leviticus 6:2. And a different verse states, all night until the morning, and he shall remove the ashes that the fire has consumed of the burnt offering on the altar, and he shall put them beside the altar. It's the next verse, which indicates that one may remove the ashes at any time during the night, including the limbs of a burnt offering that were already hardened by the fire. So how do we reconcile these texts? And Rav explains, we divide the night into two parts. Half of the night, i.e. until midnight, is designated for the mitzvah of burning, and during this time, that which is dislodged from the altar shall be returned. And the second half of the night, i.e. after midnight, is designated for removing, right? Cleaning the altar, and depending on whether it's Yom Kippur, depending on whether it's a regular day of the year, 350 days of the year, or a festival, or Yom Kippur, there's going to be a slightly different schedule for when they clean. On regular days, the priest would perform the removal of the ashes starting from dawn. On Yom Kippur, they would perform the removal starting from midnight. And on the festivals, they would perform the removal starting from the beginning of the second watch, so between midnight and dawn. I'm almost done. Very short daf today. Questions or comments, please get them in now. With regard to Rav's assertion that one may begin to remove the ashes only after midnight, Rav Kahana raises an objection from a Mishna, Tractate Yoma, page 20a. Every day the priest would remove the ashes from the altar and place them on the east side of the ramp at the crow of the rooster in the morning, or close to the time of its crowing, whether before it or after it, as there was no insistence on a precise time. On Yom Kippur, they would remove the ashes at midnight. On the festivals, the ashes were removed even earlier, at the end of the first watch. Rav Kahana concludes his objection, and if it enters your mind that the proper time of removing the ashes by Torah law is from midnight, how do we advance the removal of the ashes on the festivals, and how do we delay their removal the rest of the year? So rather, Rabbi Yochanan says the proper time of the removal of the ashes is based on the following. From the fact that it is stated with regard to the burning of the limbs, all night, Leviticus 6:2, don't I know that he may burn a burnt offering until the morning? If so, what is the meaning when the verse states until the morning? It means add another morning to the morning of the night. Arise before dawn, as that is the time of the removal of the ashes. Nevertheless, there is no specific hour fixed for performing this removal, and one may remove the ashes from the beginning of the night. Therefore, every day, performing the removal at the rooster's crow is sufficient. On Yom Kippur, due to the weakness of the high priest, who must perform the entire temple service on that day, they would hasten to remove the ashes from midnight. On the festivals, during which there are many offerings on account of the masses of Jewish people in Jerusalem on those days, who in order to offer their sacrifices would arrive early at the temple, they would remove the ashes from the beginning, they would remove the ashes beginning from the end of the first watch, which is before midnight. As the Mishnah teaches in the latter clause, the call of the rooster would not arrive on festivals until the temple courtyard was filled with Jews. That's where we'll stop, right at the very bottom of page 86b. Take a couple of comments here, or just one. And just a reminder, I'm traveling tomorrow to visit my dad, and on the East Coast, and I hope, as I've done before from his house, to be broadcasting, at our regular time tomorrow, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. So if something goes wrong, then look on the Facebook page, and I'll post if there's going to be a delay or a postponement. But if all goes well, then we'll have class at the regular time, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then Wednesday is my travel day when I won't be able, just the way the scheduling works out, I won't be able to do it that day. But hopefully we're going to stay at the regular schedule, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. One comment, Joe, hooves, horns, and hair fur are all made of keratin, which smells terrible when burned. Think of singed hair. Did they burn frankincense with it to cover the smell? Well, I think what they did is they didn't burn those things, right? Generally speaking, they didn't burn it. Just sometimes it was still attached, and then it ended up getting placed on the fire. I don't know if the frankincense, which was burned, although not necessarily with the burnt offering, right? And the incense, which was always going, we just did that because God said so. I think it might have the effect of covering up things that were unpleasant like this. I don't know that that was the purpose of it. And Sharon, did the Kohanim stay all night for the burnings? I mean, I think that they had a shift, right? They were there all week, right? A particular watch, this group of priests would serve for 1 week at a time. There were 24 watches, so they would do twice a year, plus all of them would serve on holidays. So I would imagine, and there was like a team of them, right, who were in that watch. And so I would imagine that some of them would get deputized each night to do those overnight procedures, but not all of them. I wouldn't think they would need that. That's my guess. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, see you tomorrow, Sunday, regular time, God willing, from the East Coast. All the best. Shavua Tov. Good luck.